Here are 6 of the most insane Amazon jungle stories ever told on Joe Rogan. Encounters so shocking and unreal. In episode 2013 of the Joe Rogan Experience, explorer Paul Rossely revealed the terrifying reality of the Amazon. From nights of torment under mosquitoes to a jaguar breathing inches from his face, and even encounters with uncontacted tribes, his stories show how unforgiving the rainforest truly is.
The Amazon rainforest is vast beyond comprehension. It stretches across 9 countries, covers more than 2 million square miles, and houses species still unknown to science. To most, it's a green blur on a map. To Paul Rossely, it was home. He had spent years guiding, studying, and working in its depths. He knew the rivers, the sounds, the plants, but he also knew something most outsiders never understand. In the Amazon, the moment you step away from the river, you step into a labyrinth that doesn't let you go. You can walk 15 feet, Paul explained. Turn around and never find your way back. The forest plays tricks. Every direction looks identical. Shadows warp distance. The air is thick, swallowing sound. Even the compass, mankind's trusted tool for centuries, becomes unreliable. The iron-rich sap of certain trees pulls the needle, twisting north into false directions. And when GPS batteries die or signals vanish beneath the canopy, the reality becomes clear. You are alone. Paul discovered this the hard way. On a solo journey meant to test his skills, he found himself lost. At first, it was subtle. A wrong turn. A trail that didn't connect where it should. But soon the realization sank in. The map in his head no longer matched the forest around him. Night fell quickly. In the rainforest, darkness isn't gentle, it's total. Within minutes, the jungle becomes a wall of black, broken only by the hum of insects and the occasional cry of something unseen. He strung up his hammock, believing he'd at least rest, but even that betrayed him. The mosquito netting, poorly designed, left his back exposed. What followed were nights of torment. Hundreds of bites turned to thousands. His skin inflamed, itching and burning until it felt as if the insects were burrowing under his flesh. Sleep was impossible. Exhaustion crept in. Hunger gnawed at him. And fear, not the sudden, sharp fear of a jump scare, but the heavy, suffocating fear of knowing he might never find his way out, settled into his bones. On the 6th night, something changed. Paul woke abruptly. Not because of mosquitoes. Not because of heat, but because of a sound. Breathing. Not his. Not shallow or anxious, deep, slow, powerful. The kind of breathing that comes from an animal whose lungs fill with authority. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks. Hallucinations weren't uncommon after days without sleep. But then came the vibration, the subtle growl that rumbled through the ground beneath his hammock. He turned slowly, lifted his headlamp, and froze, 6 inches away. The face of a jaguar stared back at him. Its eyes reflected the weak light, glowing like embers. Its whiskers twitched, its nostrils flared. He could feel the heat of its breath against his cheek. Every primal instinct screamed at him to move, to fight, to run, but he knew better. In the Amazon, sudden movement is death. The jaguar growled once more, low and deliberate, before stepping back into the shadows. For Paul, the message was clear. This was not a random encounter. This was a reminder. In the jungle, you are never alone. And survival is not a matter of strength, it's a matter of respect. But predators are not the only forces hidden in the forest. Paul also spoke of the uncontacted tribes, groups of people who live in complete isolation, maintaining traditions older than history itself. They leave few traces, but their presence is undeniable. The way they reveal themselves is subtle. Calls that sound like birdsong but linger a second too long. Monkey cries that echo from multiple directions at once. To the untrained ear, it's just noise. To those who know, it's communication. Paul described stories of men traveling upriver, only to realize they were surrounded. The calls came from every angle, coordinated, controlled. Panic set in. One man escaped by crawling into the river, moving silently like a turtle. Others weren't so lucky. These tribes possess knowledge outsiders can only dream of. They can start fires in a rainforest where everything is soaked, a feat that seems impossible to those who try with matches and fail. They live free of infection in an environment where outsiders fall ill within days. They vanish into the jungle without leaving a footprint. To them, outsiders are obvious: perfume, bug spray, shampoo, scents that reek like sirens. In a world of animals who navigate by smell, where Paul blends in, washing in the river and abandoning modern comforts, tourists glow like beacons. Animals scatter. Tribes watch from the shadows, and the truth is simple: in the Amazon, invisibility is survival. The jungle also holds mysteries that stretch beyond the living. Paul recalled the story of Percy Fawcett, the legendary British explorer who, in the early 1900s, vanished into the Amazon in search of a lost city. Fawcett was no amateur. He had resisted infections that killed his companions. He had outlasted men hardened by war and expeditions. His obsession was unshakable: the belief that deep within the rainforest lay the ruins of an advanced civilization, proof that the jungle once held more than tribes and wildlife. But one day, he disappeared. Over 100 people would later die searching for him. Some believed he was killed by hostile tribes. Others claimed he found what he was searching for and chose never to return. His body was never found. His camp was never recovered. The jungle swallowed him whole. For Paul, Fawcett's story is not just history. It's a reminder. No matter how strong, how skilled, or how determined, the Amazon answers to no one. And if the predators, tribes, and legends weren't enough, there are the invisible threats: disease, infection. Paul himself nearly died after contracting mistas, a vicious bacterial infection. What began as mosquito bites turned to raw wounds. Scratching spread the bacteria through his skin until lesions covered his body. He eventually returned home, barely making it through customs in New York. His face was swollen, his skin scarred. The officer at JFK looked at him and muttered, "Buddy, what the hell happened to you?" Paul spent days in the hospital, fighting for his life. That is the Amazon's final weapon. You don't need a jaguar's claws or a tribe's arrows. A single scratch, a single bite can spiral into death.
A jaguar in the night, hidden tribes in the trees, explorers swallowed without a trace. The Amazon isn't just a rainforest, it's a force that chooses who returns and who disappears forever. In episode 1927 of the Joe Rogan Experience, wildlife biologist Forrest Galante pulled back the curtain on one of nature's most enduring legends: the existence of colossal snakes. From 30-foot anacondas to a 100-foot serpent reportedly striking at an aircraft in the Congo, his stories blur the line between discovery and myth.
Forrest Galante doesn't chase thrills the way most people imagine. He doesn't leap from airplanes or climb cliffs without ropes. His rush comes from eye contact with predators, darting a bear, restraining a lion, or diving beside an anaconda. For him, those moments ignite weeks of energy. They are not stunts. They are field work. Yet they also tap into something older, something primal. And nowhere does that primal fear surface. More than in the legends of giant snakes, the Amazon has long been the stage for these stories. Hunters whisper of anacondas thick as barrels, stretching 30, 40, even 50 feet. Tales describe cattle dragged into rivers, fishermen vanishing beneath coils, canoes tipped and swallowed whole. Science is cautious, recording verified specimens at around 26 feet, weighing hundreds of pounds. Impressive, yes, but smaller than the monsters of rumor. And yet, Forrest believes there's reason not to dismiss the stories outright. Look globally. Wherever there is tropical heat, endless wetlands, and a glut of prey, there are giant snakes. Indonesia boasts the reticulated python, a predator capable of exceeding 20 feet. Southeast Asia hosts the Burmese python. India and Africa each have their own rock pythons. South America's rivers hold the anaconda. Everywhere conditions allow, serpents stretch to terrifying lengths. One place, however, stands out: the Congo Basin in Central Africa. A land of swamps and forests still poorly explored, where myths persist and evidence is scarce. And from that region comes one of the most extraordinary accounts ever recorded. During World War II, Belgian Colonel Remy van Leer flew a reconnaissance mission over the Congo. He was not a man prone to fantasy. Decorated, disciplined, and respected, he carried the credibility of military honor. Alongside him were two passengers, equally sober men. As their plane passed over the dense canopy, movement below caught their eyes. At first they thought it was a log, then it shifted, then it coiled, a snake, not 20 feet, not 30, something so massive it rewrote the scale of possibility. They estimated its length at nearly 100 feet. Disbelieving, they circled the animal once, twice. On the third pass, they dropped lower. The snake lifted its head from the ground, rising nearly 10 feet, striking toward the aircraft. Its head alone, Van Leeuwen later said, measured 3 by 2 feet, the size of a tabletop. Lunging toward them, descriptions followed. Scales of brown-green, a pale underbelly, triangular jaws. All three men agreed. They had seen the impossible. A photograph was taken. To this day, it remains analyzed but never debunked. Genuine, though inconclusive. Proof, or merely the strongest piece of folklore ever committed to film? Consider what such an animal would mean. A predator longer than a basketball court. A creature capable of ambushing elephants or crocodiles. A serpent so large it would need to strike at planes in defense, and yet skeptics argue, where are the bodies? The shed skins? The carcasses? Forest counters with this. The Congo is understudied. Its swamps are vast, its rivers labyrinthine. Animals of immense size can exist in low densities, surfacing rarely, vanishing as quickly as they appear. To locals, such creatures may be known. To Western science, they remain unseen, but the Congo is only one chapter in a global book of serpent legends. In Indonesia, villagers once claimed to have captured a python nearly 49 feet long, weighing close to half a ton. Photographs appeared in newspapers, fueling frenzy. But upon closer inspection, the truth deflated. The snake measured just over 21 feet, still massive but far from a record. Perspective had stretched the legend. Camera angles had turned a big snake into a mythic one. This is the pattern. Snakes shrink under measurement. What began as a 40-foot monster becomes a 20-foot specimen. Hunters swear of beasts wider than oil drums, only to present something half the size. Yet still, among the embellishments, kernels of truth remain. Forrest has handled such snakes himself. He recalled wrestling with an 18-foot reticulated python, a body as thick as a man's thigh, scales shimmering like armor. Its weight broke their scale at over 200 pounds. That was real. That was terrifying. And yet, that was still only half the size of the rumors, so the question becomes, if we know snakes of 18, 20, 22 feet exist, is 30 impossible? Is 35? Biology says no. With enough food, enough time, and the right conditions, growth can push boundaries. Reports of such giants, while unverified, may be exaggerations of reality or glimpses of truth, and there is precedent, 60 million years ago. After the extinction of dinosaurs, a snake known as Titanoboa slithered through prehistoric South America. Reaching nearly 40 feet in length and weighing over a ton, it was the largest serpent to ever live. Its fossils prove beyond doubt that nature once built snakes the size of buses. If evolution did it once, could it not again? But the legends are not always fossils or photographs. Sometimes they are whispers, carried by people who live where scientists do not. Forrest spoke of uncontacted tribes, isolated groups living deep in the Amazon and the Congo. Their stories may never reach the outside world. Yet among them, rumors persist of snakes longer than canoes, thick enough to crush men, capable of swallowing entire prey animals whole. To them, these aren't myths. They are warnings. Western ears rarely hear these stories. When they do, they dismiss them as superstition. But consider this, these are the same tribes who can start fire in a rainforest where everything is soaked, who can navigate without compass or GPS, who survive infection in environments that kill outsiders within days. Their knowledge is precise. Their senses are honed. And when they describe a creature, perhaps it deserves attention. Imagine sitting by a fire as a hunter describes the night the river split, and a shadow thicker than a canoe rose from beneath the surface. Imagine hearing the voice of someone who has lived his entire life in the forest, insisting that such snakes are not fantasy but fact. Forrest urges caution, not dismissal. Science thrives on evidence, yes. But history is littered with animals thought extinct or mythical, only to be discovered later. The coelacanth, a fish believed gone for millions of years, turned up alive in 1938. The giant squid, once a sailor's nightmare, is now documented on film. Why not a serpent of unusual size, hiding in places we rarely look? The debate over giant snakes is a tug-of-war between skepticism and wonder. On one side, photographs that shrink under scrutiny. On the other, stories too consistent to ignore. Forrest doesn't claim certainty. He admits many tailies are exaggerations, but he also refuses to close the door. Because every expedition into the unknown carries the chance of rewriting what we think we know, he points out the double-edged sword. Once science arrives, mystery dies. A creature cataloged, measured, and displayed loses its aura. Legends fade into data. But until then, the possibility lingers, and perhaps that's what keeps the legend alive, the space between proof and imagination, where shadows and rivers stretch longer than they should, and photographs hint at monster science has not yet embraced.
From the swamps of the Congo to the rivers of the Amazon, stories of giant snakes continue to coil around the edges of science. Maybe they're myths, maybe they're memories of Titanoboa reborn, or maybe, somewhere in the world's last wild places, they still move unseen, waiting for us to find them. In episode 1932 of The Joe Rogan Experience, bat biologist Merlin Tuttle shared stories that sound less like science and more like survival horror. From jaguar calls in the jungle to river bandits on the Orinoco, and even tribal warriors who nearly took his life, his work with bats carried him into some of the most dangerous corners of the earth.
Merlin Tuttle never set out to live a life of danger. His passion was bats, understanding them, conserving them, showing the world their beauty. But to study them meant going where they lived. And often where bats lived, people did not. The caves, jungles, and rivers he entered placed him face to face not just with wildlife, but with tribes, bandits, and moments where survival came down to a heartbeat began with the Yanomami. Merlin was told of an area upriver, 30 miles from camp, that would be rich with species he had never collected before. But that territory was controlled by a Yanomami group infamous for their hostility. Anyone who entered was met with arrows. No outsider had ever made it far. Merlin stayed away until word came that the warriors had left on a raid against another tribe. The timing seemed perfect. Bravery, or perhaps hubris, carried him upriver. With a Venezuelan assistant, he pushed a dugout canoe to the bank and slipped into the forest. Nets were set, waiting for bats to rise in the night. Then came the sound. Not one man, not two, dozens. Feet pounding earth, voices rising. A war party on the move. Merlin froze. If discovered, they would be dead before they could flee. He remembered one thing: the Yanomami preferred ambush. Rarely did they chase prey openly. So Merlin and his assistant pressed into the jungle, silent, and waited. Hours dragged. Only at 2 a.m. did they dare creep back toward the canoe, lights dimmed, steps like whispers. Somehow, they slipped away unseen, but caution is a fragile thing. The very next night, believing they had gone far enough to be safe, Merlin returned to the work. Nets were stretched again. The forest was quiet. Then came the sound of a jaguar, at least that's what it was supposed to be. His Yanomami and Mikiritari guides froze. Their faces turned pale. Not El Tiger, they insisted. Indians. The roars were not cats. They were men imitating jaguars, signaling each other in the dark. The enemy they had fled the night before had found them. Merlin, skeptical, thought his men were exaggerating, even trying to avoid work. He grabbed his shotgun and stalked toward the sounds, thinking he might kill a jaguar. But the movement was wrong. Too fast? Too coordinated? The growls were not animal but human. Finally, realization struck. These were warriors. He hurried back to his men, who were seconds away from abandoning him to save themselves. Together they fled into the night, leaving the nets behind. The proof came the next day. When they returned to recover the equipment, the nets were stripped. Every strand had been stolen. Whoever had been in the jungle with them, they had walked away with the spoils, The warning had been real. Merlin had narrowly escaped becoming prey, but danger wasn't confined to the forest. Sometimes it waited in caves. Merlin once crawled belly first through a narrow cavern passage when something moved ahead. A cobra, its scales glistening, body sliding silently toward him. In that tunnel there was no space to turn, no room to retreat. He lay flat, motionless as the serpent slid past. The moment stretched, breath held, muscles screaming for release. Only when the snake had vanished into the dark did he exhale. Alive by inches. Another time it wasn't snakes or tribes, but men on Venezuela's Cano Cassiquare, the world's longest natural canal. Merlin's team camped to collect for the Smithsonian. They carried cash, small bills hidden in false bottom trunks, funds wired through military grants. The secrecy was necessary, the money always needed. But word travels fast in remote regions. Locals began to suspect the scientists carried hidden wealth. And in a place where law was thin, suspicion could mean blood. One day, helpers burst into camp shouting, "Bandits are coming!" Upstream, a motorized dugout approached, armed men on board. They carried guns, muzzle loaders stuffed with black powder and rocks, crude but deadly. Merlin had minutes to choose, hold to his upbringing as a conscientious objector or fight. He thought of his crew, 8 or 10 lives in his hands. He chose. Weapons were distributed. M1 rifles, double-barrel shotguns, pistols. Each man took cover behind rocks and logs. When the dugout drew near, Merlin shouted in Spanish, "We know who you are. If you land here, we will kill you." The bandits pressed closer. He shouted again. Then, with guns raised, his team revealed themselves. The bandits hesitated. They were nearly on the bank, 1 meter from forcing the fight. Finally, faced with the odds, they turned back, their motor carrying them into the distance. No blood spilled, but Merlin's conscience was forever changed. In the face of death, he had chosen to arm and threaten, to abandon the purity of objection for survival. It was, he admitted, the most important lesson of his life. And still, the jungle called him deeper. In 1967, Merlin set out to visit the Shamatari, a tribe so remote they had seen only 2 outsiders in their history. To reach them meant hiking 46 miles through wild country, across rivers and ridges, carrying a 40-pound pack. With him were a Yanomami translator and a Makiritari guide. Every word Merlin spoke had to travel 4 languages, English to Spanish, Spanish to Makiritari, Makiritari to Yanomami, Yanomami to Shamatari. Each sentence slowed by a chain of tongues, each phrase at risk of distortion. Misunderstandings were inevitable. What he did not know was that the Shamatari were not seeking contact for curiosity. They were preparing for war. Their enemies were near. And when the outsiders arrived, the tribe saw not scientists, but allies, men who carried bang sticks. Guns they hoped could turn the tide. That first night, the tension became clear. The Shamatari built their shelters apart, leaving Merlin's group exposed, bait for any attack. His guides grew uneasy. One had seen villages raided before, seen the dead littered in silence after night assaults. He told Merlin what to do if it came. Play dead. Even without enemies at the gate, the nights were chaos. Villagers sick with malaria writhed in fever. Others, believing disease was caused by spirits, inhaled hallucinogens. Powdered vine snuff blown into nostrils until visions danced. They shouted, raged, fired arrow after arrow into imagined demons. The air shook with frenzy, the line between ritual and violence nearly broken. Merlin filmed it all. Camera rolling as tribesmen convulsed and roared, arrows flying at phantoms. Then, in one moment, the frenzy turned on him. A tribesman, high and wild-eyed, lunged with a weapon. For an instant, Merlin's life hung on the edge of a hallucination. His presence, his foreignness, made him the target of imagined evil. He escaped, but the image remained burned into his mind, the night he nearly died. Not by jaguar, not by snake, but by the hallucinatory vision of a man who had never seen his world before. Merlin would later say, he never sought adventure for its own sake. He sought bats, but to reach them meant passing through thresholds most would never dare cross. Tribes with arrows, bandits with rifles, cobras in caves. Even the beliefs of people who saw him as spirit or enemy, the price of science was danger. And in those shadows, Merlin discovered as much about himself as he did about the creatures he studied.
Jaguar calls that weren't jaguars, cobras sliding through caves, bandits with rifles, and tribes that mistook him for a weapon of war. Merlin Tuttle went searching for bats, and instead found the razor's edge between life, death, and discovery. In episode 1284 of the Joe Rogan Experience, Graham Hancock challenged everything we thought we knew about the Amazon. Beneath the jungle canopy, he argues, lies the ghost of a forgotten civilization, millions of people, mysterious man-made soil, and vast earthworks aligned with the stars. The rainforest, he says, may not be wild at all, but a garden built by human hands.
The Amazon has long been portrayed as untouched wilderness, an endless sea of trees, rivers, and animals that resisted human imprint. For decades, archaeologists insisted no great culture could thrive there. The soils were too poor, the terrain too harsh. The region too remote, but new evidence suggests otherwise. The Amazon basin is massive, 7 million square kilometers. Of that, 5.5 million remain cloaked in dense rainforest, virtually unstudied. To put that in perspective, that's the size of the entire Indian subcontinent. Imagine trying to understand world history while ignoring India. That's how little we truly know about the Amazon for most of the 20th century. Scholars believed humans only entered the Amazon around 1,000 years ago. The jungle, they argued, couldn't sustain dense populations. But over the last 2 decades, something startling has emerged. The deforestation that scars the Amazon clearing land for cattle and soy has, ironically, revealed secrets buried for centuries. Beneath the trees, explorers have found grids of channels, vast causeways, and geometric earthworks. Patterns too deliberate to be natural. Evidence of settlement. Evidence of cities. The Spanish conquistador Francisco de Orellana traveled the Amazon River in 1541 to 1542. His journals described vast civilizations. Along its banks, cities alive with art, crafts, and millions of people. Yet a century later, other Europeans saw only jungle. Orellana was dismissed as a liar. Now, his words no longer seem like fantasy. Archaeologists believe the truth is this: Orellana did see those cities, but he saw them just before they vanished. When the Spanish entered the Amazon, they brought more than swords. They carried smallpox. The disease tore through indigenous populations with terrifying speed. Within 50 years, millions were dead. The cities emptied. The jungle swallowed them whole. By the time later explorers arrived, the ruins had already disappeared under vines and trees. Recent studies suggest the Amazon may have held a population of 20 million before European contact. For comparison, London in the 16th century had just 50,000 inhabitants. Imagine dozens of Londons scattered through the jungle, connected by roads and waterways, then erased almost overnight. But how could such numbers survive in a region known for poor soil? The answer is one of the Amazon's greatest mysteries: terra preta, or black earth. Unlike the thin, nutrient-poor rainforest soil, terra preta is rich, fertile, and enduring. Created by humans thousands of years ago, it remains productive even today. Farmers still prize it, scooping handfuls from ancient patches and spreading it across barren ground. Instantly, crops flourish. Terra preta is more than just enriched dirt. It contains unique microbial life absent in neighboring soils. Its secret lies partly in biochar, a form of charcoal created by slow, smoldering burns of organic waste. But even modern soil scientists struggle to explain the microbial component. It is as if ancient Amazonians engineered an ecological technology we still can't replicate. With this man-made soil, millions could be fed. Forest that once seemed hostile became farmland. The jungle wasn't a prison, it was a garden, cultivated by human hands, and the evidence doesn't stop at soil. Across deforested regions, archaeologists have uncovered massive earthworks, circular ditches, square embankments, even octagons enclosing perfect circles. Their geometry is precise, their scale enormous, hundreds of meters across. These are not random clearings. They are henges similar in design to those found in Europe and England. Henges like Stonehenge and Atherbury are iconic ditches and banks built for ritual, not defense. The Amazonian henges mirror that design. Some are aligned to true norths, south, east, and west. Not magnetic north, astronomical north. To achieve that requires astronomy. Careful observation of the heavens. This implies a culture in the Amazon, capable of advanced geometry and celestial measurement. A culture organized enough to mobilize thousands to shape Earth on a monumental scale, and yet, these sites hold no evidence of permanent habitation. No refuse, no trash heaps, no signs of daily life. They seem to have been ceremonial places of ritual, perhaps tied to beliefs about death and the afterlife. Hancock argues they echo a global system of sacred architecture, built to connect heaven and earth, soul and cosmos. If that sounds speculative, consider what modern technology has revealed. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, uses lasers to scan landscapes from above, stripping away vegetation to expose hidden structures. In Guatemala, LiDAR revealed 60,000 previously unknown Mayan structures around Tikal, all within walking distance. A revolution in archaeology applied to the Amazon. LiDAR has begun to reveal similar results, countless earthworks hidden beneath trees, waiting to be mapped. And remember, this is in a region 5.5 million square kilometers wide. Guatemala is just 100,000 square kilometers. If tens of thousands of ruins hid there, what might lie under the Amazon's canopy? Already, sites like Yokosa reveal breathtaking complexity, squares enclosing circles, octagons framing squares. Geometric exercises like squaring the circle, long credited to ancient Greece, were being performed in the Amazon millennia earlier. Some structures date back 3,500 years, rebuilt and reused over generations. But how old the tradition truly is remains unknown. What's clear is that these were not primitive people scraping by in the wilderness. They were astronomers, engineers, and farmers. They cultivated trees, favoring species like Brazil nut and ice cream bean, creating what ecologists now call hyperdominant forests, groves shaped by deliberate human selection. The Amazon rainforest itself may be, in part, a man-made construct. Think about that. The pristine wilderness is actually an ancient garden, carefully tended by millions who understood how to live with it. Their knowledge was nearly erased by disease, colonization, and time. But fragments remain soil that still feeds crops, earthworks that align with the stars, geometries that speak of lost science. We are, Hancock says, only scratching the surface. The mysteries buried in those 5.5 million unstudied square kilometers could rewrite human history. And until LiDAR surveys the jungle completely, we won't know the true scale of what was lost. Perhaps one day we'll realize that civilization did not just rise in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or Greece, but also in the heart of the Amazon, where stone circles were drawn in earth, where soil was engineered to feed millions, and where the stars guided architects long before modern science.
Beneath the jungle canopy lie the ghosts of cities, the fingerprints of astronomers, and the dark earth that still feeds life today. The Amazon may not be untouched wilderness, but the forgotten cradle of a lost civilization. In episode 1518 of the Joe Rogan Experience, artist and wanderer David Cho recounts the most reckless journey of his life, a teenage expedition into war-torn Congo to find a living dinosaur. What begins as boyish obsession becomes a descent into chaos, starvation, civil war, and a jungle that tries to unmake the mind. This is the story of how curiosity can turn into a survival test.
There's a kind of restlessness that doesn't ask for roller coasters or skydiving. It asks for borders with no signs, roads with no names, and the sense true or delusional that you might be the first person to see a thing that shouldn't exist. For David Cho at 18, that restlessness had a shape. A brontosaur-like creature whispered about in National Geographic and campfire talk, the Mbembe of the Congo Basin, if scientists were still turning up new species each year. If frogs were the size of dinner plates and spiders a child could hold with both hands, Why couldn't there be a dinosaur left behind by time? He was living on a kibbutz in Israel, half working, half hustling illegal shifts in a casino, odd jobs at a wedding hall, sweating in farm fields by day and feeding a library-fed imagination by night. In that library sat an old National Geographic compendium, reports, rumors, and grainy photos of a creature that didn't fit the modern world. It was enough. He decided he would go, not as a scientist, as a kid with a story, a borrowed identity, and a stubborn will getting to Congo in the mid-1990s. Wasn't like booking a flight to Paris. The country wasn't open to tourists. He had to invent a reason to enter a bodyguard to a toothpaste executive, some mix of audacity and paperwork that passed at the border. Aeroflot took him on a rattling route through Moscow, Malta, and a stitchwork of African stops, the cabin crowded with cages and livestock, the air thick with heat and fear, and the smell of 1,000 separate lives trying to get somewhere else. 3 days of limbo ended in Brazzaville. The door opened to a different kind of air, the burn of trash fires, a wall of humidity, and a city rattling under the distant crack of gunfire. No internet, no phone, no real map. French he didn't speak. A civil war he didn't anticipate. Factions with names like the Ninjas and the Cobras traded shots by night. Tracer rounds climbed into the sky like dirty fireworks. In the background, there were rumors of Ebola, malaria, and the kinds of diseases that turn luck into a coin flip. Everyone wanted to know what he was doing there. He wasn't sure he could explain it even in a language they understood, but the pull of the river was stronger than the warning signs. He found a way north to the jungle north, to the last rumored crossing of the creature's path north until the city fell away and the green swallowed the horizon. Somewhere near Wesso the modern world thinned to a dirt track. The forest rose vines, giants of hardwood, and a canopy so tight it turned noon into late afternoon. This was the part that made the myth feel rational. If anything could hide, it could hide here. He wasn't alone. There was another traveling young European drifting on his own private mission. On paper, the two of them were a toothpaste executive and a bodyguard. In reality, they were two strangers with a bad plan. At first, the arrangement worked: shared coins, shared rations, shared bravado. Then the path narrowed, bent, disappeared. The trail didn't end so much as it dissolved into the forest floor. Turn around, walk 3 paces, and the world looked like a photocopy of itself. Bugs sang in tones that felt like fever. The heat was not temperature, but presence. They were lost. It's one thing to lose your way in a mall. It's another to lose your way in a jungle that never repeats itself, where the difference between north and more trees is academic. They tried to ration food crackers, a tin of tuna, something sweet to trick the body into calm. But hunger is an impatient negotiator, and desperation finds old habits to slip into. Rations went missing. Water purification tablets were for them both until they weren't. The stranger ate without asking, drank without thanks, and spoke to David like the made-up story was suddenly true, like this was a hierarchy instead of a partnership. The jungle has a way of running old resentments through an amplifier. Every slight gets louder. The jungle tests your body. Famine tests your math. How many days can you go on a handful of crumbs? How many hours can you walk while your mind starts bartering with hallucinations? By day they trudged, machete through vines, more circles than progress. By night they lay inside a thin tent that felt like a lung, the fabric breathing with the weight of insects and the thump of unknown bodies bumping past. The moon looked close enough to pluck. Sleep frayed into strips. The mind started speaking in bad ideas. There is a point in the story where David's honesty goes cold in your hands. The point where hunger, humiliation, and fear braided into a thought he didn't recognize as his. He imagined picking up a rock the size of his 2 hands and letting gravity do the rest. No theatrics, no struggle. 1 drop in the dark and the noise would stop the chewing, the orders, the mockery. The cash the stranger hid would buy him a way out. No one knew they were there. No one knew he was there. It would be simple. He didn't do it. That's the sentence that matters. The thin, invisible wire that divided the version of the story you're hearing from the one we are all glad he didn't have to tell. He put the rock down. He slept. He woke with the quiet knowledge of what almost happened. Then the jungle changed the subject, a tremor in the vegetation, a whisper of leaves. Higher than made sense sat a figure in a tree, a forest hunter watching them from a height that turned the ground into a map. The movement from branch to path was so fast it felt like an edit, the difference between far and near measured in heartbeats. He didn't speak English. They didn't speak his language. But hunger is a universal dialect and drawing helps. David sketched food in the dirt. The man nodded and returned with meat charred into anonymity and honey thick as sun. The body voted yes. The mouth voted no. Sometimes rescue is a gradual negotiation. What followed was a translation of kindness. The hunter led them through a series of turns that were nothing but plants to the untrained, and became a village as if revealed by magic. Children laughed. Women carried babies and fruit. Men looked busy at something that had been done the same way since the first fire. The visitors were not common here. The dye in David's hair and the angle of his face drew hands to his cheeks. There was an elder who knew a little French. Through him, the village said what so many remote places have said to so many travelers. You look like you've come from the sky. There is a warmth and hospitality that tastes like medicine. They fed him. They laughed at how he ate. They watched him draw. He drew again the old sketch, a long neck, a thick tail, the shape you learn as a child when the word dinosaur arrives in your brain like thunder. He pointed to the river. They nodded. Not impossible, yes. To the people who lived with the river, stories of shapes and water were not bedtime fiction but weather things you note and respect. They described the root, wetlands, leeches, still pools where a snail might hold an invisible army of parasites that swam into the body and wrote a red signature on the end of your days. They told him a name Bilharzia, and his courage hit a threshold. He tapped out. Survival sometimes looks like retreat, but salvation doesn't always wear heroics. The same people who would have guided him toward the myth guided him out of the maze. What had been a week and a half of wrong turns became less than a day with the right eyes. That's how close the line is in the jungle between lost and found. Between a story you outlive and a story that outlives you. Back in Brazzaville, the city had its own surreal logic. In the middle distance, a house the jungle should have consumed still stood, a relic of French ambition. Ornate and out of place, a white tooth and a green jaw. Inside, a man named Francois, more rumor than neighbor, managed a ham radio and a life entirely of his own making. In a country where the road could vanish in rain, a radio was a lighthouse. When a Peace Corps worker fell ill, the radio found a pilot's ear. A helicopter came. In places like this, rescue looks like a coin landing edge up. Home is a strange word when you've carried your life in a backpack and your death in a coin toss. David wrote to his parents from an airport bench, the ink still wet with the idea he might not see them again. He mailed the letter ahead as if his words could arrive in safety even if he didn't, but he did. He came back thin, shocked, older in ways that don't register on a license. He started to draw the story. Then he started to write them comics for Giant Robot, pieces that smelled like sweat and jet fuel and the inside of a cheap tent. Vista early. Scrappy visread those words and recognized a lens they could use when the internet was still a small town. Go back, they said. Take a camera. The second trip would be worse in some ways, chiefs with short tempers, threats that felt less like weather and more like men. But that's another chapter. Years later, he would return to Africa again and again. Not for monsters, not for myth, but for something like humility. There are places you go when the noise of a comfortable life becomes unbearable, places that recalibrate the soul by making the stakes obvious. Water, food, shelter, kindness. He hunted gratitude there, not animals. He looked at hunter-gatherers still living close to the line between enough and not enough and remembered how to say thank you and mean it. As for the creature that started the whole mess, what remains? There are photos of river surfaces doing odd things. Tracks stamped into mud that might be logs or might be footprints. And testimonies from doctors and villagers who saw something big enough to bend a canoe and long enough to make a wake, where the river should have been smooth. A herpetologist might point to misidentifications, giant turtles, massive crocodiles. A herpetologist might point to misidentifications, giant turtles, massive crocodiles. A skeptic might lean on physics, the caloric demands of a 30-foot animal, the difficulties of a breeding population nobody has pinned down with a body or a bone. The truth is the river holds its cards close. It always has, but the most important thing wasn't whether the dinosaur was real. The important thing was what the search revealed. That belief can drag you out of a safe bed and drop you into a place that looks like a fever dream. That the jungle doesn't care about your reasons. It cares about your decisions. That there are people in this world for whom the forest is not a map, but a memory, not a puzzle, but a home. That the line between I could and I did is often a choice made in the dark in a tent with a rock in your hand and a voice in your ear that isn't you at all. He learned that starvation has a voice, that humiliation sharpens it, that survival sometimes depends on a stranger who can climb a tree, like a ghost, and turn a walk into a meal, and a meal into a village, and a village into a path out. He learned. That war can make tracers look like fireworks until you realize fireworks don't come with funerals. He learned that your body is a small country that can be invaded by a parasite you can't see, and your mind is a larger country that can be invaded by an idea you don't want to own. He learned that mercy toward others has a way of looping back and becoming mercy toward yourself. When you ask him why he went, the answer spools out in Knotsburdane. Vice, childhood obsessions, the LA riots ripping the mask off civilization in a single night, the sense of being an outsider no matter where he stood. All of it mixed into a fuel that burns especially hot at 18. If you need a cleaner answer, you can borrow one from a simpler world. He wanted to see if the story was true. If you need a cleaner ending, you can't have it. Some stories end with a specimen in a crate and a Latin name. This one ends with a letter home and a boy who came back different. The dinosaur stayed a rumor, the jungle stayed a fact. And a kid who might have thrown a rock put it down and kept walking, until a man in a tree waved him over and the world started making sense again. There's a photograph from one of those. Trips David in a t-shirt surrounded by forest people who'd never seen an Asian face before. Hands reaching, eyes laughing, the gap between galaxies bridged by a grin and a drawing in the dirt. Another image shows a river with an odd ripple and a shape barely rising. You could argue the light, the scale, the angle. You can argue anything. The reality is this: a life that once felt like a closed room opened into a continent, and the boy who went looking for a myth found something else he needed more. If there's a moral, it's not don't go. It's not even go. It's know that going has a cost. The jungle takes its fee in sleep, in weight, in illusions. It subtracts until what's left is the person you are when there's nowhere to hide inside your head. And then, if you're lucky, it gives something back honey on your tongue. A path out of the maze, a story that makes you grateful for ordinary light and ordinary food and the ordinary luxury of being bored. The myth of Makumbembe remains, where it always lived, between water and word of mouth, between a scientist's frown and a child's wide eyes. Maybe it's a turtle, a crocodile, a log shaped by current and hope. Maybe it's exactly what the elders say, surfacing once every while to remind the river it has secrets. Either way, the chase wrote its lesson on a kid who thought he was immortal. You're not. But you might be forgiven, and you might be led home, and you might learn how to carry your hunger without letting it decide who you are.
A boy went to find a dinosaur and found himself at the edge of what he could endure. War at night, hunger by day, and a forest that erased the path behind him until a stranger in a tree waved him back to the world. Some legends live in rivers, others live in the choices you don't make. In the Congo, David Cho discovered both. In episode #2020 of the Joe Rogan Experience, Python Cowboy recounts a fight few could imagine surviving a lone hunter deep in the Florida Everglades, squaring off against a 17-foot Burmese python. What follows is not just a story of grit and danger, but a glimpse into how invasive giants are reshaping one of America's most fragile ecosystems.
The Florida Everglades is unlike anywhere else in the United States. A mosaic of swamp, marsh, and sawgrass that stretches for miles, it is a place of hidden dangers. Alligators patrol the waters. Insects swarm endlessly. Heat presses down like a weight. And since the late 20th century, an invader has silently conquered this fragile wilderness, the Burmese python, these snakes. Often released by pet owners in the 1980s and 90s, found paradise in Florida. With no natural predators and endless prey, they grew larger, bred rapidly, and began consuming everything from raccoons to deer. Some even swallow alligators whole. For conservationists and hunters, removing them has become a mission, not just of survival, but of protecting the native balance of the Everglades. Few know this battle better than Mike. Better known as Python Cowboy. On one particular hunt, he found himself face to face with the largest python he had ever seen. 17 feet, 7 inches long, weighing in at 135 pounds. Solid muscle, no eggs, no recent meal inside it. Just raw, coiled power. The encounter began like many of his hunts do, alone. In a small 14-foot John boat, threading through canals and spoil islands carved a century ago when workers dredged the swamp. These small, overgrown islands had become prime territory for invasive predators. For Mike, they were hunting grounds. As he stepped onto one island, he saw movement. Not the flick of a tail or the flash of scales, but something larger. He spotted only the back half of the python, sliding slowly into thick vegetation. Even with just a third of her body visible, he knew instantly this was a monster. His heart raced. It wasn't fear of death, not exactly. Years of experience had taught him confidence in handling snakes. His fear was different, that he might lose her. A python of this size, if it slipped into the swamp, could vanish forever, free to keep devouring native wildlife. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but there was a problem. He couldn't see her head. The safest way to control a python is to secure its head with both hands, preventing it from striking or wrapping its coils. But here, the head was buried in thick cane. If he pushed too close, she could spook and disappear. So he made a split-second decision. Grab the tail. It was risky. Grabbing a python's tail often means being dragged. In thick swamp vegetation, that can be fatal. The snake can anchor itself, weaving through weeds, pulling its pursuer into water and mud. But Mike knew he had no choice. If he hesitated, she would be gone. He lunged, seized the tail, and the battle began. Immediately, the python surged forward, dragging him toward the swamp. The raw strength of 135 pounds of muscle against his own body was staggering. He dug his heels into the limestone beneath his boots, straining, fighting to hold her back. For a moment, it became a tug-of-war between man and serpent. Then she turned. The python began to hiss, twisting to face him. This was what Mike wanted. If she struck, he could locate the head. But the risk was clear. One misstep, and her teeth would sink in at first. The strikes came slowly, predictable arcs of muscle and jaw. Mike dodged them, bobbing and weaving like a fighter. Floyd Mayweather in the swamp, he later joked. Each miss gave him another chance. Each dodge brought him closer to control, but then she did something unexpected. Snakes usually strike, recoil, then strike again. This time, she fainted. She pulled back only partway, then snapped forward in a sudden off-angle strike. A veteran hunter might anticipate many things, but not that her teeth sank into his arm. The pain was instant. But worse than pain was the sight. Blood spraying, pumping from his arm in bright, terrifying arcs. She had caught not just skin, but veins and possibly an artery. Her recurved teeth, angled like fishhooks, punched deep. If she held on, she could coil. If she coiled, the fight would end in seconds. By instinct or luck, Mike pushed forward, forcing her head off his arm before she could latch. Blood poured freely, but he had her now. One hand locked tight on her head. Still, danger lingered. He was alone, miles from help, growing weaker with every heartbeat. He didn't fear bleeding to death outright, but fainting. If he passed out in that swamp, the snake would wrap him, crush him, and leave him for dead. He forced himself to breathe, to stay calm, to slow his racing heart. Blood still streamed from his arm. He needed a tourniquet. With one hand gripping the snake's head, he fumbled with the other, improvising with the only tool he had, his snake bag. Normally meant to hold smaller captures, the bag became a lifeline. He wrapped it tight around his arm, cinching the bleeding shut. The python, meanwhile, began to tire. Cold-blooded animals have limits. After 10 minutes of struggle, her immense body slowed, her power fading. She became, in his words, a limp noodle. Finally, he could breathe, but the job wasn't done. He still had to carry her back to his boat. With the head clenched in his grip, he staggered across the swamp, dripping blood, adrenaline pushing him forward. Only when he reached the boat could he finally dispatch her with a bullet, ensuring she would never prey on the Everglades. Again, the footage, captured by GoPros strapped to his body and placed nearby, was as shocking as it was mesmerizing. Blood, struggle, raw human will. And yes, he admits, one of his first thoughts as the blood sprayed was, "This video is definitely going viral." It did, but beyond the drama, the encounter highlights a deeper truth. Burmese pythons are apex predators in Florida, but they are not native. They don't belong. And their impact is catastrophic. Mammal populations in parts of the Everglades have dropped by more than 90%. Rabbits, raccoons, opossums, gone. Even deer and alligators fall prey to these giants. For Mike, every python removed is one small step toward balance. And his story, as wild as it sounds, is not just about personal bravery. It's about a war humans are fighting to protect. Fragile ecosystems from the consequences of our own mistakes. The Everglades is still beautiful, still vast, but it is changing. And stories like this remind us of both the ferocity of nature and the resilience of those who stand against it.
In the swamps of Florida, man and python met in a struggle as old as myth. One walked away, one did not. But the battle for the Everglades continues, a reminder that the wild is never conquered, only endured,